Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. When you start your day with a cup of coffee, what do you read to catch up on the latest news? New York Times, BBC, Drudge Report, Huffington Post, AP news feeds? Lately, I've been starting with articles in Mint Press News. Great journalists, intelligent domestic and international reporting, and often well-researched and timely anti-war and imperialist content. But if you read the Wikipedia page about Mint Press News, you'll learn that the site publishes disinformation and coded anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It supports Russia and Iran, and it reports geopolitical events from an anti-Western perspective. Why has their Wikipedia page consistently been smeared and edited by mysterious sources? Why has Google search traffic dropped 90% in just the past few years and Facebook referrals down 95%? Who's trying to deny me access to one of my favorite news sources? Let's discuss. Warm greetings. And warm greetings from, are you in Scotland, Andy? Or Alan, I'm sorry. Are you in Scotland right now?
Yes, I am. That's right.
Well, good. And Greg is in Pittsburgh. I'm in Tacoma, and we are excited to have you as our guest. You're a prolific journalist. Greg and I have been following you for quite some time, and we are just excited to have you on our show. You did a PhD at Glasgow University in 2017, and your book, Bad News from Venezuela, I guess, was part of your dissertation. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely correct. I guess it was my attempt to try and make sense of what's going on in Venezuela and understand the media coverage, the political situation there, everything.
And it's still going on, and it's still pertinent. Some things never change, but well, maybe we could just start talking a little bit about the Venezuela book and some of your conclusions about that. This is Bad News from Venezuela, 20 years of fake news and misreporting. And we could add another decade to that, I guess, correct?
Absolutely. As I said, I was interested to understand what was going on in Venezuela because there were a lot of important thinkers that I admired that were saying, this is a place that's really worth looking at. But then at the same time, I was reading in the media that this place is like a nightmare dictatorship. It's falling apart. It's the worst place in the world. And so really, I didn't know what to think when, I see some people saying it's great and some people saying it's terrible. I thought, well, I'm going to have to do a research project to find out what was going on. And what I found was that by looking at charts and data from places like the United Nations, the World Bank, etc., what was going on in the 2000s was really a remarkable democratic renaissance. I shouldn't even say renaissance, just a democratic birth in the country. Um, Connected to a huge economic transformation of the country after Hugo Chavez was elected president. We saw incredible pro-poor legislation being passed and gigantic changes in the standards of living and just the general political situation going on in Venezuela. And yet that wasn't being reported on in the media at all. And so what that book was, and the PhD that accompanied it, was really just trying to get to the bottom of what is going on in Venezuela and how it's being reported. And I guess some of the real underlying, big things that I found was that not only is the reporting completely skewed and uh, the country shown in an extremely negative light, but from actually talking to the journalists that produced the news, I found that this wasn't by accident. This was very much an intentional decision by many of these journalists. You know, Actually, when it comes to a country in the global south like Venezuela, there's only a few dozen people who are really reporting the news from there for Western audiences. And they are, for the most part, either Westerners who have been parachuted into the country, often without even the ability to speak to Spanish. These Westerners often live in the confines of eastern Caracas in gated communities, surrounded by armed guards, and very rarely actually interact with the local public. But also, what I found was the general milieu of these people was that they were very much, they saw themselves as like the foot soldiers in the revolution against Hugo Chavez and against socialism in Venezuela. And they were very, very open with me when I asked for interviews. Some of them said that, for example, they considered themselves quote unquote mercenaries for hire, and that they were the sort of tip of the spear going against the Venezuelan revolution. One guy, Anatoly Kurmanayev, who now works for the New York Times, covering Latin America, he told me that he intentionally plants grossly exaggerated or false stories into the media, and he does that because they have an agenda, the agenda to overthrow the government. He called this concept sexy tricks. This was a few months before the word fake news really became well known in common parlance. Other journalists who couldn't really or wouldn't toe the line that they were being told to write about, being told from the top down and from their colleagues, said that they felt they had to constantly self-censor, when they were writing, and eventually they were just forced out of the industry altogether. So the fact that Venezuela is being presented as like this, comical dictatorship where everything is falling apart and everybody's sad and we just need to intervene somehow to restore democracy or whatever. This isn't an accident. In fact, this is very much the result of a conscious effort from the owners and the advertisers in big corporate media who do not want to see a country with a overtly socialist government succeed.
Greg, we've had like three people who've been related to Venezuela. VJ Prasad, I think, went down and did some of the election coverage. Dan Kovalik has gone to Central America and did a book on Venezuela. And who's the Midwest Marks guy? Carlos. He actually went down and did some election, engineering or election observing. And they said the election was there were some problems, but by and large they have much stricter election integrity laws than we do, and that the negative information coming from the election coverage was just a couple of outlets that that were the vast majority of the people in Central America were saying this was a positive, it was a good
Yeah,
election.
the media doesn't care really about the election. I mean, they're going to portray a winner in an election as a dictator anyway. I mean, that's part of what you draw from it. I thought part two of your book was just phenomenal because you can generalize it to other places. I mean, I follow casually. I'm not a scholar as you are, but casually Syria, Ukraine, and those areas, and you don't have to know a lot to be struck by the fact that, for example, around Syria in the war, there were no Western journalists in Syria. They all reported from Beirut. I mean, this one woman, I think AP woman, would always tell you what's going on in Syria from Beirut, and the same thing in Ukraine. You get no coverage from the Russian side unless you follow the Russian media, but our media doesn't cover it at all. So your chapter two in that Venezuela book, or the second part of it, I thought was phenomenal because it could be generalized. I'm old enough to remember, not remember, but know about, say, the Spanish Civil War and the New York Times. They would have a journalist on the Franco side, and this is their notion of balance at that time, and then one on the Republican side. Today, there's not even an attempt to have anybody representing the other side in these conflicts. And I think the fact that there were, what, four major media companies represented in Venezuela when you wrote your book, Miami Herald, WAPO, Times, and Journal, says it all. They live in a small community. They're all upper middle class white kids that went to elite schools. I mean, you really tell the story, I think, beautifully through them. I mean, let them talk and explore this. Would you agree that it's a kind of a you can generalize that today across all these other hot points?
You know, Actually, I definitely would agree with that. it's very interesting because sometimes when I explain what's going on in Venezuela, I'm often talking to foreign people from all over the world. And I often ask them I just start by saying, what is the media coverage of your country like? And they will, immediately start telling me about how ridiculous, how shallow it is, how they rely on these tropes which are completely untrue. And this is, as I said, generalizable to people from anywhere in Asia, China, Eastern Europe, South America, Africa. They all know that the media is completely cartoonish when it comes to their country. And then that's kind of a lot of the time how I start, talking about what's going on in Venezuela, because anyone who's had to rely on media coverage from American media coverage of their country knows that this goes on, but sometimes they don't realize that it is actually generalizable and it's not just to their own country. When it comes to Venezuela, as you were saying, Pat, uh, the presentation of the elections, uh, more than 2 decades of elections has been that this is, a sham democracy where nothing works and the people are just going through the motions. But, I was in Venezuela for the last elections as well, where I even met Vijay Prashad there. We were coincidentally we went and attended a similar march that was going on. And, I spent more than a day going around the various election centers. I visited 5 in Caracas, most of which were in opposition strongholds. And what I found was a situation of pretty much complete normalcy. I would talk to the officials that worked at the election centers. Nobody tried to stop us at any point, even though we were pointing cameras in people's faces and everything. Their reaction was one of polite indifference or somewhat friendly as well. And this goes for people who were overtly members of the opposition. So, for example, in one central Caracas constituency I went to, the head of the election center there openly told us on camera, a bunch of international journalists from Africa and North America and Europe, that she was a member of the opposition, that she hated the government, and that she was only doing this job to save up money, and then she would leave the country. Nevertheless, when I asked her what the situation was like on that day, she said it'd been completely calm, completely tranquil. And we asked her about the election system itself and whether she had any qualms or foibles with it. And she said, absolutely not. The election system is completely secure. And we were shown it by her. And it really is a remarkable system where in order to vote, you need your
Mm,
ID card, and then that's checked
fingerprints.
off against the electoral roll. And there's obviously a picture on that, so the official, looks at your face, looks at that one. Then you have to supply your fingerprint on a fingerprint scanner that has to match the one that's on the database. Then you go out and vote on an electronic voting machine. There's a lot of checks and balances on that. And then once you have voted, the voting machine prints out a paper ballot. You then check the paper ballot to make sure it's the same as the one you voted on the machine, and then put the paper ballot in a big box. At the end of the day, that box is collected, and the receipts, the ballots are tallied in front of officials from any party or any, you don't even have to be from a party, you can just be a member of the public who wants to observe this process. And if there's a discrepancy of even one from the electronic count to the paper ballot, all hell is broken loose, and then they have to get um, the National Electoral Council in to check what was going on, etc. The 2013 election, which was one I know a lot about, there was a discrepancy of 22 nationwide, which means that the paper ballot was 99.98% accurate. When compared to the electronic ballot. And that was because 22 people around Venezuela had voted on the machine but not put the paper ballot in the box. But even after that, you're still not done with the electoral process, because after that, you have to go back and sign your name on the electoral register saying that you voted. And then you have to put your thumb in an indelible inkwell and then put your thumbprint next to your signature just to make sure that you can't vote again. So this process is extremely secure, and there are many, many checks and balances put in to the system. A long time ago, Jimmy Carter called the system the most advanced in the world, meaning much more advanced than the United States system or anything in Europe, for example.
Mhm.
But none of this is reported in corporate media, who like to present the situation as one where Venezuela is a country with sham elections, where a dictator rules over everyone, and the opposition are completely cowed. That it couldn't be further from the truth when you actually go there. On election day, we were stopped constantly by people of the opposition who were only too pleased to tell foreigners what they thought about the government. And they would, in Britain, we call it, they would chew your ear off, meaning they would just talk, jabber at you for minutes and minutes about all the problems in the country, about how the government is trash, about how their candidate is much better, and they're confident that they're going to win this time. But, that didn't happen, unfortunately for them. And so ultimately, we had this situation where, country, the United States, with serious problems with its election infrastructure, whether that's, voter suppression, gerrymandering, money in politics, etc., is throwing stones from a glass house at a country with one of the strongest electoral systems out there. And so, yeah, I mean, just to go back, uh, this sort of reporting of foreign countries can be seen by a lot of foreigners or people who have a special interest in other countries, whether, as you said, Greg, it's Syria, or whether it's Israel, Palestine, or whether it's Russia or China or any country you can really name. This is happening on a global level. And so
Right.
what I'd say is that if anyone who's been watching the news for the last, say, year and has realized there's a particularly bias when it comes to, say, Israel, Palestine, it's really like that for pretty much every country. And it gets worse whenever that country is the target of US sanctions or the US empire more generally. And Venezuela is really ground zero for that right now.
And that's the theme that you've taken the baton and now you're running with it. The theme of widespread misreporting, fake news, so forth. It the 2 days after the election, the New York Times had a reporter out saying this was, completely fraud and so forth. And when I looked at, my sources, which are often Mint Press and other things, he was the only reporter reporting that, and it was it was an agenda of him to say that. I think the other thing that we don't realize is that you don't get a lot of reporting about the opposition wanting to take the nationalized oil industry and turn it over to Exxon. You don't get you you know you don't get the other side of the story. You just get this boogeyman that is this new Castro that's going to destroy everything. And who's coming across the border? I mean, we've destroyed this country with sanctions, and they're the ones that are making the trip up here because not because they love America, but because we destroyed their country with our economic policy. So, oh well, preaching to the choir. I don't know. Am I wrong there?
I think that's such a good point. So often we look at these countries and say, oh, they're failing, etc. But we don't look at the reasons for why they're failing or why things are so bad. And they also don't make the connections that all the countries that the United States are trying to overthrow are also failing at the same time. So in Venezuela, they will say, oh, look at the inflation rates, oh, look at the shortages. This means that socialism doesn't work. But they'll never tell you about the US sanctions, which have blockaded the country and have caused a 99% reduction in oil exports, which means that, yeah, 99% of Venezuela's foreign income has just disappeared up into smoke. And they never make the connections to the fact that, uh, Iran is also, supposedly a failing economic country, or North Korea or Cuba or whatever. They won't tell you that these sorts of connections are actually happening because the most powerful country in the world, the United States, is carrying out what is akin to a medieval siege on these countries. They will just say, failing society, bad, bad dictator or something. And the reason for that is that they are laying the groundwork for any sort of future intervention that the United States might want to do. And as you said, they don't ever really mention about the sort of US-backed opposition, the sorts of opposition which in Venezuela's case, Leopoldo Lopez, one of the leaders of the opposition, actually said that the United States should come in and directly rule over Venezuela for a few decades before handing over control to him and his friends. It's just extraordinary the sort of policies that these oppositionistas actually hold. And yet they're never talked about in the media. And when they are, they're often presented as like social democrats, leftists. They're never talked about as conservatives or fascists, which would be frankly much more accurate. They're always presenting people like Juan Guaido, this US-backed, Trump puppet, as like a social democrat to the left of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or whatever. It's
Right.
it's ridiculous. The United States wouldn't back him if he was to the left of her. So, it's obvious that this is a total farce. And anyone who starts looking into this with a bit of a critical eye can see this, and the facade falls away completely and very quickly. However, the fact of the matter is that most people in the West generally don't travel all that much. There's a great stat that the majority of Americans still don't own a passport, and the majority of people who do own a passport use it to go and visit relatives across the border in Mexico or go to Acapulco or whatever. And that means that our image of the rest of the world comes mediated through a handful of gigantic corporations, your CBSs, your Foxes, your CNNs, etc., which gives them enormous power to paint whatever sort of portrait they want, emphasize things and leave out other things. And so when we talk about, say, the migrant crisis in the United States, or in Europe for that matter, it's never connected to NATO's misadventures abroad. We never ask, why is it people from Afghanistan and Libya and Syria that are coming to Europe and not places like Israel or Lebanon or Saudi Arabia? It's because those are the countries that haven't been bombed into smithereens by NATO. And likewise, when it comes to Latin America, it's the countries that the United States have ground into a pulp where those people are fleeing. They're not fleeing from, Brazil or Uruguay or wherever, where the United States isn't trying to wreck the economy. And internal documents show that that is specifically what the United States is trying to do. But that sort of connection is never made, precisely because it would undermine the imperial project that the US and NATO are trying to carry out around the world.
Yeah, and that gets to your second book, which I'm a huge Noam Chomsky fan. My license plates are personalized. They say Chomsky, so that's how big of a freak I am about Chomsky. And I realized that you collaborated with Chomsky. Vijay Prasad collaborated with Chomsky. We had Nathan Robinson. He wrote the most recent book with Chomsky. Gosh darn it! And I didn't get him on. I sent him a podcast invitation, and he didn't get back to me. So he's anyway. This is still manufacturing consent. Of course, everybody who knows anything knows that in 1988, Chomsky and Herman, Edward Herman, wrote the famous book Manufacturing Consent, and your reporting is taking, like I said, taking the baton and running with it. You're updating this kind of propaganda model, bringing in contemporary things that weren't around in '88, like Cambridge Analytica, fake news, the bots, RussiaGate, all of these things that are part of that. Tell us about this book.
Well, yeah, sure. So that book came around in 2018 because it had been 30 years since Herman and Chomsky had published that seminal book, Still Manufacturing Consent, which really shows how the media really functions internally and how it puts out so much propaganda, fake news, and misleading reporting about pretty much every subject you could talk about. And Herman and Chomsky talked about how there were all these filters which affected the output of the news. They said that the ownership of the news was a really important filter, that billionaires that owned the news would make sure that their agenda was very uniquely covered in the output of their newspapers. They said that advertising from corporate sources was a real factor in determining what sort of news stories were covered and what weren't covered. So, for example, if you took a lot of money from a big chemical company, you're much less likely to talk about the environmental damages that chemical companies wreak on America and on the world. They talked about how sourcing really affected the news, that you were supposed to go to official highbrow sources like people in the government or people in big think tanks, which generally are funded by corporate America or by the government, meaning that those people would color the reporting and sort of push it in certain directions. They talked about how there was a whole load, an industry of flack where where journalists would receive all these sort of negative feedbacks if they started to really criticize power. They would get, letters written about them. Pressure groups would start. Government agencies would start saying that you were a bad journalist or whatever. A great example of this might be Gary Webb, the famous San Jose Mercury journalist who uncovers this extraordinary conspiracy where the United States government was actually was actually basically doing drug running all over Latin America and even sending drugs into black communities in the United States in order to use the profits from that to fund death squads in Latin America. And Gary Webb faced huge torrents of abuse from officials and from other journalists, leading to his depression. And in the end, he took his own life because of that. But yeah, so Chomsky's book,
Chris Hedges,
Chomsky and Herman's book,
Chris
yeah,
Hedges is a remarkable reporter. Got knocked out of the New York Times just because he was saying the Iraq War was bogus, and
exactly.
the
And he's
list
not
goes
the only
on and
one.
on and on and on and
Yeah,
on.
yeah. But anyway, that book was written in the 80s, so it was showing a little bit of age, and so much had changed since then in terms of the media, specifically the rise of the internet and social media. So I thought I wanted to update that book and really look about how media is really how it's affected in this modern society with all of the smartphones and all of the new technology and ways of communication. And what I found was really that the same ideas that Chomsky and Herman talked about in the 1980s not only held, but were actually stronger. So when we look at ownership, for example, in the 1980s, people were worried that in the United States, only 55 corporations owned the majority of the news output of the US. Well, I got news for you, it's a lot less than 55 nowadays. I think it's only five. And then when we look at online, the internet, which was supposed to set us free and be this new free market where everybody can communicate completely openly and together and would break down barriers, etc. That's really not happened. We're mostly on a handful of websites and apps like Twitter, like Instagram, like Facebook, that are owned by multi-billionaires who all seem to live in California and all have very deep connections to the US national security state.
Mhm.
And likewise, all the other filters have gotten stronger in these days. When we talk about advertising, the money for journalism has dried up completely because of the rise of Google and Facebook, who now handle all our advertising, send us, super directed ads to our phones constantly. That means that newspapers, radio shows, etc., just don't have the sort of budget they had before, which means that they're more susceptible to pressure from advertisers or advertising boycotts. They're much less likely to rock the boat when it comes to annoying, powerful figures. And that just continues on. We're under so much time pressure as journalists nowadays that if we really want to go against the grain, we have to do it on our own time because, most journalists have to write 5, 6, 7, 8 stories per day if you're working somewhere like The Guardian or CNN or wherever. That's the standard nowadays, that you're pumping these things out in an hour, perhaps, 2 hours max. You can't really do any sort of good journalism there or any sort of investigative reporting. And that's why real investigative reporters are being sidelined. People like Chris Hedges have been marginalized and now have to, survive on the Substack economy where hopefully he can find or we can find a few hundred people willing to chuck us, a few dollars a month to keep it going. That is a very bad situation to be in. And so, unfortunately, what Chomsky and Herman talked about in the 1980s has only got more relevant now in the 2020s.
Right. Greg, why don't you jump in here? You turned me on to Alan by constantly forward me mint press news articles, and that's kind of how I came about knowing you, Alan. What's your opinion?
Well, as you know, Pat, I'm not part of the Chomsky cult. I don't think that was such a groundbreaking fact. It certainly brought it to the attention of a lot more people because Chomsky has a much bigger audience than, say, Michael Parenti, who really wrote in 1986 Inventing Reality, which I think was a very similar but perhaps more accurate portrayal of how the media functions, because it really based it upon capitalism, which is something that Chomsky doesn't really want to talk about. And that's why he has such a big following, because he leaves open the possibility that journalism is reformable in terms of the way the world is, if there weren't such monopolization. The bias of the media goes way, way back before even the Cold War. And that's another weakness of Chomsky. He doesn't understand the role. He does understand. He chooses not to deal with the role of the Cold War. Um, so that's a factor. But fundamentally, if we're going to talk about answers, we've got to talk about private ownership. And private ownership is always going to put fetters on it. When I was a youngster and wasn't a socialist or a communist or any ism, I didn't belong to any ism. I remember the Beyond the Fringe review, which was a very famous UK review with these four characters who subsequently became very famous. And they did a thing about the about Fleet Street, a mockery of it, about how the journalists were all, behind their hands, they were all criticizing Beaverbrook and all the big monopolists. But they had to do this, and when they wrote their novels, they were going to expose the whole industry. Journalists are not. I mean, they essentially are selected, and then they self-select themselves, and they continue to tell the story that gets them a job. Like any of us do that ever held a job, we do what we're told to do, and so it's an old adage, but the answer lies in getting around private ownership, public ownership in some fashion or other of the media, and then we could have true journalism. But yes, it is getting worse. Yes, we can locate the moment in which the large papers decided they didn't want to, they couldn't afford any more foreign journalists. And I think you document that well in your Venezuela book, those four that go down there, four major papers that still do it. But it could be better under capitalism too. I mean, Wall Street Journal is an example of a paper which I read, ironically, because my politics are very left, because they feel compelled to expose some things that could challenge capitalism. For example, they're leading the way right now. You won't find on the left anyone doing better work on exposing Medicare Advantage. They're leading the way on that. I mean, they're writing articles about the cheating, because they want to see it work. And the New York Times is absolutely an irrelevancy today. They're just an asswipe to the capitalist ruling class. That's all they are. I mean, they don't present anything alternative. They used to be the liberals all flock to it. I guess they still do, but it doesn't offer anything original. So I read Mint Press because it's independent. It's really simple. I want independent journalists. I mean, they struggle. Many of them struggle. They're on Patreon. They're trying to make a living. We've had many, many of them on. Um, what I'm disappointed in is, in the end, so many of them are still tied to the Democratic Party. They really think that's reformable and that can be changed. What I like to what I like about Alan is his discussion, for example, most recently of Syria, the coup in Syria and what it means. There's absolutely no cover. Can you imagine a person who is on the terrorism list in the United States with a $10 million bounty suddenly is remade into a liberator? I'm shocked when I talk to my friends, non-political friends, and they say, well, now Syria is free. It's insanity. I mean, how do we get away with putting a bounty on this guy, and then a day later he's a hero? And people buy it. Can you explain that? I mean, can you explain that's really out of the bounds of Chomsky or Peretti or anybody else? It's just madness.
I mean, Parenti wrote the book Inventing Reality, and I think this, when you're talking about Giuliani, I think this is a fantastic example of inventing reality right here because, you know, it's we'll talk about Giuliani first, but this is actually something that goes back much further. Yeah, Giuliani, as many people will know, or probably a lot of people won't because it's not really being reported. He was the founder of Al Qaeda in Syria, the Al Nusra Front. He was given $1 billion by the head of ISIS to start a caliphate in Syria. And he was the leader of what the corporate media in the 2010s called the moderate rebels, which meant the anti-Assad forces of, Al-Qaeda in Syria. And they were, you know, newsflash, they were not great to a lot of the local population. They terrorized them, they killed them, they, massacred them, they oppressed women, etc., etc. And as you said, Giuliani was on the terrorist list. He had a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head from the US government. And yet, the whole time that was happening, the US was actually secretly working with Giuliani at that time. There's a very famous email that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan sent Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I think it was in, it might be in 2012, but anyway, WikiLeaks published it, and it said, in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. That was the message he sent to Clinton. So the US has always had a very complicated relationship with Giuliani. And if you read anything from the 2010s, they will say that this guy is the stereotypical radical Islamic head chopper guy. And yet, in the space of just a few weeks, he was uh, right, he had a real renaissance. They turned him from this guy into this modern, secular, democratic ruler who, yes, he had a very dark past, but he's on the path to reform. It has been astonishing watching the rebrand happen in real time of Abu Mohammed al-Jilani as he, takes off his traditional West Asian clothes and puts on Western style clothes, cuts his hair differently. He actually has a real strong resemblance to Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky when he does this as well. So there's a huge rebranding effort going on, but actually this isn't new. We've seen this sort of rebranding going on time and time again. A great example was Osama bin Laden, who in the 1980s and very early 1990s was considered basically like, an anti-Soviet hero. There's actually a very famous article in the Independent newspaper in the UK, which calls him an anti-Soviet warrior, putting his country on the path to peace and development. Now, obviously, we know what happened to bin Laden in the 90s and 2000s. He was turned into, well, his actions turned him into public enemy number one. But this sort of rebranding happens constantly in the media. If you can go back even further and look at how, Saddam Hussein was considered just the darling of the United States and of Washington in the 1980s when he was carrying out some of those worst crimes. And yet suddenly by the 1990s, he was the new Hitler. Or if you go back even further, Joseph Stalin was the worst man in the world in the 1930s, according to the United States press. And then suddenly, when the US enters a coalition with the Soviet Union during World War II, he's changed into Uncle Joe. And then the minute 1945 happens, it's back to the old presentation of Stalin. So, you got to make up your own mind about these things because media, they will present, as Malcolm X said, media, if you're not careful, will have you loving your oppressors and hating the people trying to free you from oppression. So you really got to do your own research about this and get away from corporate media because, yeah, they're selling you their story constantly, and you've got to be very aware of that whenever you're reading it. So you have to be reading and whatever you're consuming, you have to really, go through it with a fine comb and treat it with as much skepticism as if you were listening to a speech by Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or any other politician you're, not supportive of, because that's really the sort of level of scrutiny we need. We need critical media literacy and we need critical discourse analysis constantly. Because, Karl Marx once said, question everything, right? And that really starts with questioning what you're reading.
Yeah, and that's like, it's always under the guise of freedom, democracy. We paint these. What did Chomsky say? That said, brainwashing under democracy. That concept that we just use this propaganda to rebrand these people that are now the freedom fighters that were the bad guys in the past. So, um, hey, let's talk about your Mint Press articles. A couple of them. Greg, I'm sure you have a couple too. I want you to chat about the new the unit, the 8200 unit in the Israeli secret service unit that all of a sudden now is sitting in the BBC and the New York Times editing all the headlines for Gaza to ensure that the appropriate terms are either deleted or added, um, and working directly in cahoots with the power structures in these huge media outlets. Fill me in on that.
Well, first I'll have to say what Unit 8200 is the largest and most notorious organization within the Israeli military. Unit 8200 is really the centerpiece of the IDF. It is the centerpiece of Israel's national security state and the surveillance system that it is built to spy on Palestinians and indeed on the world. So Palestinians in Gaza, they have all their messages read, they have all their private texts, their conversations stored. Even when they walk out into public, they are tracked by face recognition technology. That means that whenever they hit any checkpoints, a lot of the soldiers address them by name before they even get there, because the soldiers know who they are, because Unit 8200 has built this incredible spying system that it uses to surveil and extort Palestinians. One example of this is that Unit 8200 whistleblowers were said that they were told to memorize all the different Arabic slurs for gay and listen out to them and for to listen out to them in conversations so that if they could find a gay Palestinian who's still in the closet, they could use that to extort them and turn them into an informant. Unit 8200 was also behind the Lebanese pager attack, which injured thousands of civilians. Its agents have also created a lot of the most infamous spying technology that we've seen, like, for example, the Pegasus spying software that was used to surveil people like France's Emmanuel Macron or the Prime Minister of India, Imran Khan, or indeed Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi intelligence used Pegasus in order to track Jamal Khashoggi, and they later killed him in the embassy with a bone saw. So this is the sort of information that Israel has, and it all comes from Unit 8200, this group whose mission is cyber warfare, is surveillance, is extortion, it's all the dirty tricks that intelligence agencies do. So they would be about the last sort of people you would want to invite into your news agency or into your social media group if you were trying to charge them with trying to distinguish what is true and what is false, and really calling balls and strikes for the world. And unfortunately, my research has shown that there are great numbers of former Unit 8200 agents who are actually working in influential roles in America's newsrooms and indeed on social media platforms like Google and Facebook. In America's newsrooms, one of the most important Israeli spies working in America right now, I should say former Israeli spy, is Barak Ravid. He is Axios's one of the chief political reporters at Axios, and he actually won the prestigious White House Press Correspondence Prize for reporting this year. It was given to him by Joe Biden himself, who embraced him on stage. And yet, until at least 2023, Barak Ravid was an analyst for Unit 8200. And now he is the person who is judged to be the best political reporter in the United States, who is telling millions of people across America what is happening in Israel and Palestine right now. That seems like a gigantic conflict of interest, which at the very least should be disclosed, but it never is. Frankly, in my opinion, that is, well, let's put it this way. If somebody was from Hezbollah intelligence or was from the Russian FSB, the successor to the KGB, there would be no chance in hell that they would ever get a job at somewhere like Axios or CNN or the New York Times, who have employed former Israeli intelligence officers in key positions, telling people about the news about what's going on in the Middle East. But, that's just the sort of milieu we live in because there are hundreds of former Israel lobbyists also working as journalists or producers in top newsrooms across the country. I mean, one of the executive directors of MSNBC is a former IDF intelligence commander, or the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic magazine. He he actually volunteered to become an IDF prison guard during the first Palestinian Intifada. And in his memoirs, he actually says that he covered up prisoner abuse when it happened there. So these are the sorts of people who are actually deciding what America hears about and what it doesn't hear about, and including when it comes to the Middle East, which is absolutely outlandish and obscure. And it's actually perhaps even worse on social media, unfortunately, because Unit 8200 agents or former Unit 8200 agents now hold very important and influential positions um, in top social media companies like Facebook and Google. One example is Emmy Palmore, a former Unit 8200 agent who now sits on Facebook's advisory council, which is a group of 24 people from all around the world that ultimately decide what is allowed and what isn't allowed on Facebook, the direction of the political content that's allowed on there. Now, the fact that she used to work for such an agency as Unit 8200 should it should cause major alarm bells. But unfortunately, it's not. And I think the proliferation of Unit 8200 agents into social media outlets and into corporate media across America is one of the many reasons why the coverage of Palestine that we've seen since October 7th, 2023, has been so devastatingly one-sided, so ridiculously pro-genocide, and so obviously biased and skewed towards one side of the debate that so many people across the world and indeed in America itself are, turning off their televisions and canceling their subscriptions and looking for alternative sources
Right.
of information like Mint Press. So yeah, that in a nutshell is what we're talking about when it comes to Unit 8200.
Yeah, and Jonathan Cook wrote this article recently, which is how the Western media helped build the case for genocide in Gaza, and you're reporting on the 8200. I mean, to think that there are people in the BBC that say, okay, striking this, you said genocide, ethnic cleansing. We don't use those words. Slaughter, massacre, no, we use the words like conflict or clashed with or something like that. You know, the when a Palestinian is killed, they bury it on the sixth page. When a Israeli is killed, it's first page news, and all of these techniques are actively employed right now in both the New York Times and the BBC, and I'm assuming the Washington Post now. It's amazing. I didn't know this until I started reading you, Alan. That's why I think you're just so doggone cool. I mean, it just go like I'm an idiot. Why can't I see this so clearly at the time? But that's why your reporting's so good.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. Yeah, as we said, we've seen internal memos leaked from top people at CNN and the New York Times. For example, New York Times staff are not allowed to use words like refugee camp or genocide or slaughter when talking about Israeli actions in Gaza. In fact, they're not even allowed to use the word Palestine very often in their reporting.
It's all
And that's a
Hamas.
clear, yeah, I mean, how are you supposed to report on this without using those sorts of words? It's like saying, yes, you can report on an elephant, but you're not allowed to use the word elephant, trunk, tusk, Africa, mammal. The whole point is to try and obscure these facts. Now, to be clear, what I'm talking about, the large majority of the people we're talking about in these newsrooms are not Israeli. They don't come from the IDF. They're not from Unit 8200 or anything, but they are pro-Israel because that is the general milieu of the United States elite class. And the reason for that is Israel basically um, serves as what some people have called an unsinkable battleship in the Middle East. It's like the 51st state of the United States. It provides that sort of lieutenant on the local beat role that the United States needs there. And so, because of that, it gets to do whatever it wants, and the United States will support it. This is not altogether that much different from how so many dictatorships across the world are treated with kid gloves in the media. When how many people really know, for example, the name Paul Biya, who's the dictator of Cameroon, who's been in charge of the country since Gerald Ford was in office in the United States. Not many people, right? And that's because he is behaving himself. He is a loyal client of the United States, so he doesn't get negative coverage. And it's like that when it comes to Israel as well. These people in newsrooms are generally, we grow up in that sort of pro-Israel milieu, and that's because of what's going on. So I'm not saying that there's some sort of gigantic conspiracy to infiltrate these places. What I am saying is that it really is telling that we live in a media environment where being the former speechwriter to Benjamin Netanyahu, or being a former IDF intelligence officer, or working for the Israeli government or whatever as an aide to the president of Israel isn't seen as a black mark against you in the industry. And in fact, it seems that it can actually help you rise up the ranks in a way that, for example, if you were an ex-Marine or an ex-US Navyman, that might help you, get a job somewhere. It's seen as unproblematic, and that is frankly a gigantic problem when it comes to US media. It really shows you how bad the corporate media culture is right now.
Greg, is this all going to be solved when Elon Musk buys Twitter? Or
Absolutely.
buys TikTok, I mean, buys
That's the
TikTok.
answer. Yeah, Elon Musk. No, I'd like to ask you, it's not only that you present a truthful picture, and obviously you and other leftish or left-wing journalists offer this up to people. If they want to go find it, they can find it. But let's face it, it's on the margin. I mean, it's you can't get into the mainstream media. But that's not enough for them. I mean, now they're attacking, even the left-wing media that we have that's honest and independent. For example, Prashad and his work, Transcontinental. New York Times went after them in a scandalous
Mhm.
article, about their funding, and it's based on China, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to get into it all because it's all bullshit, but that it's not enough that he's out there and exists, and he's giving an alternative. They have to go after it and try to demean it and diminish it. But
Mhm.
Mint Press too, I think, is been victimized. I went to your Wikipedia article, and it's just a trashing of Mint Press and its origins and where it comes from. Uh, and I view that as really a sign that you're effective. I mean, if you weren't effective, you wouldn't be getting that kind of attention. But how do you answer that? I mean, do you feel the heat from that kind of an attack?
Yeah, to a certain extent we do, because it really provides the basis for big companies like Google to delist, derank, demonetize, and sometimes even delete us because they point to, studies done by the Jerusalem Post or by some NATO-funded think tank, which say we're part of a pro-Russia nexus, or maybe it's a pro-China nexus, or maybe we're the mouthpieces of Ayatollah Khamenei, or maybe we're secretly paid by Nicolas Maduro or or the Castros or whatever. They can write that, and then suddenly Google says, well, we're going to de-rank you. So what's happened at MintPress since 2016 when this really took off in the wake of Donald Trump, the fake news, saga that was going on, is that MintPress has lost more than 90% of its Google traffic. It's lost more than 99% of its Facebook traffic. Those are the sorts of things which kill lots of alternative media outlets and have been killing alternative media outlets in the last 8 years. So just in terms of choking alternative news off, it's been very, very effective. So we do feel that. And yeah, when you're talking about Wikipedia, our page is an absolute disaster. And what's very interesting about it is Wikipedia is not some sort of blank canvas where the world comes together to decide on the truth. It's like a battleground for any sort of political subject because that is where people form their understanding of the world from Wikipedia. It's an extremely influential outlet. And what we know is that Mint Press's Wikipedia page has been edited dozens of times by this individual, Philip Cross, who has also been editing the pages of people like Max Blumenthal, people like George Galloway, people like Craig Murray, the MP in the UK, and all these sorts of anti-war, anti-imperialist leftist figures, Marxist, anarchists, whatever, to basically badmouth and denounce them and make us look as bad as possible. And the way Wikipedia is set up is that you can't challenge those edits because they come from a higher editor who's built up his score for years and years, working, 10 hours a day, 365 days a year on the same account for a decade. You can't reverse those changes. And, people are very suspicious about who Philip Cross is because has been a documented history of governments and other organized groups gaming Wikipedia. We know that, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, all of these groups edit Wikipedia. Also, police departments across the country edit Wikipedia to make themselves look better or promote their interests. Israel is a country that also edits Wikipedia. They used to have state-sponsored competitions where all of these Wikipedia editors would get together, and the one that edited the best Zionist editor, as they said in their own words, would get free balloon rides in Israel. They would win prizes and stuff. So this is an absolute battleground that we have to fight on. But unfortunately, we are a tiny outlet which has, a shoestring budget and a handful of staff. And we're fighting against much more well-funded and better organized people. And so this is what happens. Yeah, we get sidelined, we get marginalized. And so, unfortunately, the great dream of the internet being this liberatory force, it's actually being turned into basically what we had previously, where the corporate model, where there's an oligarchy of billionaires that rule the waves. And yes, you can find the information if you know where to go, but even if you're using something like Google, you won't find Mint Press on there. You won't find The Gray Zone or Counterpunch or Covert Action or any of these outlets because they've been deranked to page 2, 3, 4 of the search listings. And it's very hard to find information critical of the US and its empire. So, if you try and do any sort of Google search about the CIA or about US military interventions, you probably won't find what you are looking for if you're using Google. You have to go to some like Russian search engine, and suddenly it becomes the first. It's like the first thing that comes up. So yeah, the internet is being thoroughly sanitized of any sort of radical content, unfortunately, and that's much to the detriment of society.
But the other side of that coin, and I think that's a recent Mint Press article too, is that while I know what I want and I know where to go to find it, and I look for it, I look for Mint Press, I look for the websites that I get information, and I'm convinced that that's the truth. But the other side, I mean, the extreme other side is doing the same thing. When you have low opinion, broad low opinion of the institutions in the United States, which we have today, it means that everybody is looking for an alternative. And people are getting alternatives that are absolutely insanity, are crazy. This CIA, ex-CIA analyst, which is one of your journalists recounts on Mint Press recently, who's going around on all the right-wing talk radio shows and saying, "Oh, Al Qaeda is on our doorstep. They're hidden. They're secret cells. They're ready to explode. They're just going to explode in every city." So we're fighting for the margin. We're fighting for a voice in a place where everyone's trying to keep our voice down, and yet that's being heard probably even more effectively. That's not being censored. And we don't, I mean, we can't advocate for its censorship, but it's insanity and it's madness what people are saying in these sites. So we're
Yeah,
fighting against a mainstream, and we're also fighting against a fringe.
So basically, we're screwed. What? Correct,
No.
Alan?
yeah, 100%. I mean, it is interesting how. Listen, the good news is that people do not trust what they see on CNN or what they
Yeah.
read in the New York Times or Fox News or whatever. Trust in media has been going down, down, down forever, and people are looking for alternatives. The problem is that when they go on the internet and look for alternatives, what they're being, suggested and what is being fed up in the podcast world or the world of YouTube is utter madness and complete nonsense, conspiracy theories, racist stuff, weird, fringe beliefs, etc., etc. And the reason these are being offered up instead of more radical critiques is because they are not threatening of capital. And so ultimately, the powers that be, the billionaire class, don't really mind if people believe all these sorts of weird ideas, or they don't really care that much if they incubate a white nationalist hate movement across the West, because that's not really going to affect their profits too badly. However, if you go back 10 years or 12 years, for say, and look at what was really popular on the internet, on YouTube, and on social media, radical content was absolutely kicking CNN's butt. And that was taken away from us by, one change of the algorithm in 2016 and 2017. And this is unfortunately the world we live in. In the United States and in Western Europe, there are all sorts of very numerous movements who believe absolutely bizarre things which are not based in any kind of reality, but they're slowly gaining political power. I'm thinking about, white nationalist movements in the United States. Maybe the first thing we saw of this was maybe the Tea Party. We've got all of these, anti-immigrant workers parties, these far-right parties blossoming across Europe as well. And this is in no small part due to the sort of media we're consuming. And that is entirely to the detriment of people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk who actually control these algorithms. And they always talk about how they're going to, have an open platform, an open playing field for all voices. But that is absolute just horse manure, as anyone who works in journalism in a more radical outlet can attest to.
I'd like to talk about TikTok. I can't leave this podcast. I think I think you turned me on, or someone in Mint Press, of this TikTok account, and I'll have a better picture on the internet. And it is a young woman named Haley Lugan who has 1 million followers, and she's in the army, and she's going after recruiting these young males to come into the army. She's just this, looks like she's 16 years old, this just provocative young woman. And every single TikTok video is her and, getting showered, ready to work, or doing this, or taking selfies. It's comically titillizing. And, is she in the army? Does the army sanction this? I mean, the army can't get recruits because a young majority of young men have problems or obesity and so forth. So they're using social media, Kardashian kind of crap, to bring people into the army. It's bizarre. I don't know. I don't know how else to describe it. I think it was you that found this out. Am I right?
That's an article called From Simp to Soldier: How the Military is Using E-Girls to Recruit Gen Z into Service.
Oh
And the
God.
person you're specifically talking about is Haley Lujan, who is one of the biggest, what they call it, MilTok, the military TikTokers. She's on Instagram and all the others as well, and she has over 1 million followers now. I would say probably half of her content, maybe 25 to 50% of her content are jokes. 25 to 50% of the content is like extreme, well, not sexually explicit, but sexually implicit content of her in skimpy clothes. And then maybe 25% of her content is open military propaganda calling for boys to join the military like she is in, with the implication is that if you join up, you're going to have to meet me and you can, be with me, etc. She's always joking, like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that, she's a psyop, she's part of the CIA, ha ha ha. But here's the thing, she really is. She is a psychological operations specialist in the US military, one of a small number of army personnel whose job is to carry out influence and disinformation operations, either on or offline. So what she's saying is true. She is a psychological operation. She is in the military. And this is one of the ways in which the US military is trying to recruit Generation Z, because the vast majority of Zoomers want nothing to do with the military. Apparently, only 7% of the younger generation today is even considering joining the military. So 93% are like, no way, not doing it. And this is one of the ways they try and find people. In the past, it was, Super Bowl ads, but young people, they're not watching television. They're on YouTube, they're on TikTok, etc. So you have to go to where they are. And so the US military has been partnering with big, big YouTubers, inviting them to Air Force bases or whatever, and putting them through a day's training where, they get to climb up the nets and, do fun things like drive a tank or whatever. but they're not showing the reality of what being in the US military is, which is, the bullying, the sexual assault, the low pay, the post-traumatic stress disorder, the getting shot at by someone in a foreign country. They're not showing the reality. And yeah, this is absolutely a coordinated operation from the branches of the armed forces in order to try to raise the army or the military's profile and boost the numbers of people actually joining the military, which have been falling for years.
Yeah, and I thought Rupert Murdoch was bad. I mean, he's an unofficial member of the cabinet in the United States and in England, and he has such a remarkable influence with his media outlets, but I think that's going to pale compared to how powerful platforms like TikTok can have in influencing and propagandizing and altering people's perceptions. So I have a confession to make. Not only do I have a Chomsky license plate, but I also subscribe to her TikTok profile, just so I could, just for the research purposes, just to do the research. So anyway, hey, how can we support you? How can people support your journalism? Do you have a Substack? You obviously will link to Mint Press. Um,
Yeah,
how
well,
can
if people want
go
Yeah,
ahead?
if people want to see more of me, you can go to Mint Press News, which is mintpressnews.com, which is where I publish everything. If you're on any of the social networks, I'm most active on Twitter, which is at Alan R. MacLeod. Also
Okay.
Instagram, alan.r.macleod. And I've also got my own Telegram channel as well. If you want to support Mint Press, there's a big button as soon as you get to the Mint Press
I'll do it.
website. We've got all the major the Patreons and the donation pages, etc. So yeah, please do support us if you
I
can.
will link to all of those. And I mean, you've ever since Greg turned me on to you, you've just sort of you've changed how I see the world. And I think that's a compliment to you, Alan. You're doing remarkable work. Am I correct,
Well,
Greg?
agreed. Couldn't agree more. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you much.
Thank you
Well,
much.
thank you for the high praise.
All right. All right. We're fans. All right. Bye now.